The FBI called him one of the most dangerous criminals in America. But on the streets of Harlem, mothers trusted him with their children's safety, business owners relied on his protection, and entire neighborhoods mourned when he died. How does a gangster become a hero? This is the story of Bumpy Johnson, not the criminal the government feared, but the man Harlem loved. A protector who paid rent for struggling families, a strategist who kept corrupt cops in check, and a legend whose funeral drew thousands of mourners who called him their godfather. This is the real story of why Harlem still honors his name. If you're here for the real history, the stories of black power, survival, and resistance that don't make it into textbooks, hit that subscribe button now. We're diving into one of the most complex and misunderstood figures in Harlem's history, and you need to hear the whole truth. Bumpy Johnson died on July 7, 1968, in a Harlem restaurant. He was 63 years old, still working, still respected, still deeply connected to the neighborhood he'd called home for nearly 50 years. His funeral was extraordinary. Thousands of Harlem residents lined the streets. People wept openly. Business owners closed their shops in respect. The procession stretched for blocks, not because the city required it, but because the community demanded it. This wasn't how gangsters were usually mourned. This was how leaders were honored. For most of America, Bumpy Johnson was just another criminal, a drug dealer, a racketeer, a man who'd spent years in federal prison and operated outside the law his entire adult life. But for the people of Harlem, the families, the business owners, the elderly women who lived in his neighborhood, the artists and musicians and everyday folks just trying to survive, Bumpy Johnson was something else entirely. He was a protector, a problem solver, a source of justice when the official justice system failed them. And yes, a criminal, but a criminal who belonged to the community, not one who preyed on it. This duality, feared gangster and beloved neighborhood figure, is what made Bumpy Johnson a legend. But to understand why Harlem loved him, you have to understand what Harlem was living through. To understand Bumpy Johnson's reputation, you have to understand Harlem in the 1920s through the 1960s, the world he operated in and the community that shaped him. Harlem wasn't just a neighborhood. It was the cultural and political capital of Black America. The Harlem Renaissance had made it the epicenter of black art, literature, music, and intellectual thought. Names like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Duke Ellington, and Billie Holiday were synonymous with Harlem's creative explosion, but underneath that cultural brilliance was crushing poverty and systemic oppression, the economic reality. Black residents of Harlem faced employment discrimination, last hired, first fired, lowest paid, housing segregation, forced into overcrowded tenements with exploitative landlords, banking exclusion, denied loans, mortgages, and business capital, business barriers, permits denied, licenses delayed, constant harassment. The Great Depression hit Harlem harder than almost anywhere else. Unemployment for black workers reached 50%, families were evicted, children went hungry. Desperation was everywhere, and the city government, largely indifferent. Social services were inadequate, relief programs discriminated against black applicants. The infrastructure of support that white neighborhoods took for granted simply didn't exist in Harlem. The policing reality. The NYPD in Harlem wasn't a protective force, it was an occupying army. Cops were overwhelmingly white and racist, corrupt, demanding bribes from black businesses, violent, beating residents without consequence, unreliable, refusing to investigate crimes against black victims. If you were robbed, assaulted, or threatened in Harlem, calling the police was often useless or dangerous. Cops might arrest you instead of helping you. They might demand money to investigate. They might just ignore you entirely. For the people of Harlem, the official justice system wasn't justice. It was another form of oppression. Into this void stepped figures like Bumpy Johnson, people who operated outside the law but provided what the law refused to give: protection, justice, and order. This wasn't unique to Harlem. Throughout history, when official systems fail marginalized communities, informal power structures emerge to fill the gap. Bumpy Johnson became that alternative system, and unlike the police, Bumpy actually showed up. He actually helped. He actually cared. Bumpy Johnson didn't become a community hero overnight. He built that reputation over decades through consistent behavior, strategic intelligence, and genuine connection. Early years. When Bumpy arrived in Harlem from Charleston as a teenager in 919, he was angry, brilliant, and determined to survive. He started as a street hustler, but quickly distinguished himself through intelligence rather than just violence. He read voraciously: philosophy, history, strategy. He studied power. He learned that respect lasted longer than fear, and that communities protected people who protected them. By the 1930s, working alongside Madame Stephanie St. Clair in the policy racket, Bumpy was developing the reputation that would define him: smart, disciplined, and deeply connected to Harlem's residents. Building trust. Bumpy built community trust through specific, repeated actions. 1. He was visible and accessible. Unlike gangsters who hid in back rooms, Bumpy walked Harlem's streets daily. He knew shopkeepers by name. He greeted elderly residents. He asked about people's families. He was present. That visibility mattered. People saw him as part of the neighborhood, not someone exploiting it from a distance. 2. He kept his word. If Bumpy said he'd do something, he did it. In a world where police made promises they didn't keep, where politicians lied constantly, and where hustlers cheated people routinely, Bumpy's reliability was revolutionary. People trusted him because he earned that trust through consistency. 3. He enforced community standards. Bumpy had rules, and those rules protected ordinary residents. No robbing people in the neighborhood, no disrespecting women or elders, no bringing unnecessary violence near schools or churches. These weren't just words, he enforced them. And that enforcement made Harlem safer for everyone. Here's what's fascinating. Bumpy understood something that most criminals don't: that true power comes from community support, not just fear. He could have ruled through pure intimidation. He had the capacity for violence, but he chose a different path, becoming indispensable to the community by being someone they could rely on. That strategic choice transformed him from a gangster into something closer to an informal community leader. If this side of Bumpy Johnson, the strategic community protector, is completely different from what you expected, drop a like on this video. It helps more people discover the real, complex history behind the legend. Now let's get specific. What exactly did Bumpy Johnson do that earned him such fierce loyalty from Harlem residents? Here are documented stories that shaped his Robin Hood reputation. Story number 1: paying rent for struggling families. Multiple accounts from Harlem residents describe Bumpy paying rent for families facing eviction. During the Depression and beyond, when jobs were scarce and money was tight, eviction was a constant threat. Bumpy would hear about families in trouble, sometimes through his network, sometimes just from walking the neighborhood, and he'd quietly pay their back rent. Sometimes he'd give money directly to the family. Other times he'd pay the landlord without the family even knowing who helped them. He didn't do this for publicity. He didn't demand loyalty or repayment. He just did it because he could, and because those families needed help. One elderly Harlem resident recalled in an interview years later, "My mother was about to be put out on the street with 3 kids. She was crying, praying, didn't know what to do. Next thing we know, the landlord said somebody paid everything we owed, plus the next month. We found out later it was Bumpy. He never asked us for nothing." Story number 2: protecting small business owners. Black-owned businesses in Harlem faced constant threats: corrupt cops demanding bribes, white gangsters trying to extort them, street criminals robbing them, racist suppliers refusing service. Bumpy made it known that black businesses under his protection were off limits. If someone tried to shake down a barbershop, restaurant, or grocery store, Bumpy's people would intervene. He didn't charge protection money the way typical racketeers did. His protection came from the same pool of resources that funded his operations: the policy racket, which the community willingly participated in. Multiple business owners testified that Bumpy's protection allowed them to operate safely for years, building wealth and employing people in a neighborhood where economic opportunity was scarce. Story number 3: mediating disputes and providing justice. When residents had disputes between neighbors, between business partners, between families, they often came to Bumpy instead of the police. Why? Because Bumpy actually listened, investigated fairly, and enforced decisions consistently. Unlike the racist, corrupt NYPD, Bumpy understood the community's values and applied them fairly. He'd mediate conflicts, determine who was right, and ensure compliance with his rulings. It was informal justice, but it was more reliable than the official system. One famous story involves two families feuding over a property boundary. The police refused to get involved, saying it was too minor. The families were on the verge of violence. Bumpy stepped in, heard both sides, examined the evidence, made a fair ruling, and enforced it. The feud ended. Story number 4. Supporting artists and musicians. Harlem was the heart of black culture, and Bumpy was a patron of that culture. He frequented jazz clubs, supported musicians, and helped artists who were struggling. Some historians note that Bumpy provided financial support to musicians during lean times, helped negotiate better deals with white club owners who tried to exploit black performers, and ensured that Harlem's cultural institutions could operate without harassment. He understood that Harlem's artistic legacy was part of what made the community special, and he protected it. Story number 5. The legendary Christmas giveaways. Multiple accounts describe Bumpy organizing Christmas giveaways for neighborhood children. Toys, clothes, food for families. These weren't small gestures. They were organized events where hundreds of families received help. Again, this wasn't about publicity. These were community events that strengthened the social fabric and reinforced Bumpy's role as a provider, not just a criminal. These stories weren't isolated incidents. They were patterns of behavior repeated over decades. Bumpy Johnson built a reputation one action at a time, one family at a time, one problem solved at a time. But here's the uncomfortable question: can you be a Robin Hood and a drug dealer? Can you protect the community while also contributing to its harm? That's the complexity at the heart of Bumpy's legacy. Bumpy Johnson's Robin Hood reputation is real, but it's also incomplete. To honor the truth, we have to acknowledge the harm he caused alongside the protection he provided. The policy racket. While the numbers game provided jobs and hope, it was also gambling, and gambling addiction ruined some families. People bet money they couldn't afford to lose. The 600-to-1 payout sounded good, but the 1,000-to-1 odds meant most people lost. Bumpy's operation profited from that gap. Yes, he reinvested profits into the community, but he also kept enormous sums for himself. Drug trafficking. By the 1950s and 60s, Bumpy was involved in heroin distribution, one of the most destructive forces ever to hit black communities. Heroin destroyed families, killed thousands, and contributed to the decline of neighborhoods like Harlem. Bumpy's involvement in that trade, however strategic or limited, meant he contributed to devastation even as he provided protection in other areas. This is the brutal paradox. Bumpy helped pay rent for families while also profiting from the drug that was destroying families a few blocks away. Violence. Bumpy's code prohibited violence against innocent community members, but he absolutely used violence against rivals, informants, and people who threatened his operations. People died because of Bumpy Johnson. Families lost fathers, sons, and brothers. That violence was strategic and measured, but it was still violence, and it left scars. Control. Bumpy's protection came with expectations. He maintained power through a combination of respect and fear. People loved him, but they also understood that crossing him had severe consequences. That's not freedom, that's benevolent authoritarianism. And while it might have been better than the alternatives, it was still a form of control. So we're left with this complex reality. Bumpy Johnson was simultaneously protector and predator, community hero and criminal kingpin, Robin Hood and drug trafficker. He existed in that moral gray zone because the system left him and Harlem no better options. Official institutions failed the community so completely that even a criminal could provide more justice, protection, and support than the government. That's not an excuse. It's context. And context matters when we're trying to understand why Harlem loved a man who lived outside the law. So why did thousands of Harlem residents line the streets for Bumpy Johnson's funeral in 1968? Why do people still speak his name with respect more than 50 years after his death? Because in a community that was systematically oppressed, economically strangled, and abandoned by official institutions, Bumpy Johnson showed up. He was reliable. When the police wouldn't help, Bumpy helped. When the courts wouldn't deliver justice, Bumpy delivered justice. When landlords threatened eviction and nobody cared, Bumpy cared. That reliability, that consistency of showing up when it mattered, earned loyalty that outlasted his crimes. He respected the community. Bumpy didn't just extract wealth from Harlem, he reinvested in it. He protected black businesses, he supported artists, he enforced standards that kept residents safer. He treated the community with dignity and respect in an era when the government, police, and most of white society treated black people as disposable. He represented black power. In the 1930s through 1960s, during Jim Crow, segregation, and systemic racism, seeing a black man wield real power was rare and meaningful. Bumpy Johnson wasn't asking for permission from white society. He wasn't bowing to racist cops or corrupt politicians. He built power on his own terms and used it to protect his community. That representation mattered. It gave people pride. It showed young black men that intelligence, strategy, and discipline could create power even in a system designed to deny it. He was one of us. Unlike politicians who visited Harlem for photo ops or police who occupied it as hostile territory, Bumpy lived there. He walked the same streets. He knew the same people. He faced the same racism and economic barriers. He was part of the community, not someone extracting value from a distance. That connection made his protection feel authentic rather than transactional. The ultimate reason Harlem honored Bumpy Johnson is this: he was the best option available in a world that gave the community terrible options. Should black neighborhoods have had to rely on a criminal for protection? Absolutely not. Should official institutions have provided justice, safety, and economic support? Absolutely yes. But they didn't, and in that void, Bumpy Johnson became what Harlem needed him to be: imperfect, flawed, criminal, but present, reliable, and genuinely invested in the community's survival. And that raises the final question. Was Bumpy Johnson a hero, a villain, or something more complicated than either label can capture? Here's my question for you. Knowing everything about Bumpy Johnson, the protection he provided, and the harm he caused, do you think Harlem was right to honor him? Was he a hero, a villain, or something too complex for those labels? Drop your honest thoughts in the comments. No judgment, just conversation. Over the decades since Bumpy's death, his legend has grown, sometimes accurately, often not. Pop culture, amplification. Movies like American Gangster, 2007, Hoodlum, 1997, and the TV series Godfather of Harlem, 2019, have introduced Bumpy Johnson to millions who never knew his real story. These portrayals are entertaining, but they often simplify the complexity. They emphasize the glamour, the power, and the Robin Hood aspects, while downplaying the violence, drug trafficking, and moral ambiguity. The real man, the real Bumpy Johnson, was brilliant strategist who read philosophy and studied power, community protector who genuinely cared about Harlem residents, ruthless enforcer who used violence when necessary, drug trafficker who profited from addiction, loyal friend who maintained decades-long relationships, criminal who spent years in federal prison. He wasn't a saint. He wasn't purely evil. He was a deeply complex human being navigating impossible circumstances with intelligence, ruthlessness, and genuine community connection. The cultural legacy. Bumpy Johnson's legacy isn't just about what he did, it's about what he represented. Black power in an era of white supremacy, community self-governance when official systems failed, intelligence and strategy over brute force, the complexity of leadership in oppressed communities. His story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about justice, power, and what happens when official institutions abandon the communities they're supposed to serve. Bumpy Johnson's Robin Hood reputation wasn't myth. It was earned through decades of consistent community protection, generosity, and genuine connection. But it was also incomplete. He was a criminal who caused harm even as he provided help. He profited from addiction while paying rent for struggling families. He used violence to maintain power while enforcing rules that kept ordinary residents safer. That complexity, that refusal to fit neatly into hero or villain categories, is what makes his story so important and so revealing. Bumpy Johnson became a legend not because he was perfect, but because he showed up when nobody else did. He provided justice when the courts failed. He offered protection when the police wouldn't. He invested in the community when the government abandoned it. For the people of Harlem, that made him worthy of respect, not despite his flaws, but alongside them. His story is a mirror reflecting a brutal truth about America. When systems fail marginalized communities so completely, even criminals can become heroes. Not because criminality is good, but because the alternatives were worse. Bumpy Johnson was Harlem's godfather, not because he was the best leader possible, but because he was the best leader available in a world that offered Harlem almost nothing. And that's why, more than 50 years after his death, people still speak his name. Not with blind hero worship, but with the complicated respect reserved for figures who were deeply flawed, undeniably human, and absolutely essential to their community's survival. That's legacy, that's complexity. That's the real story of why Harlem loved Bumpy Johnson. If this exploration of Bumpy Johnson's complex legacy gave you a deeper understanding of power, community, and survival in Black history, smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're committed to telling complete stories, the good, the bad, and the complicated truth that lives in between. Next up, we're exploring what happened to Harlem after Bumpy died, how his successors tried to fill the void, and why nobody could replace him. Like this video, share your thoughts on Bumpy's legacy in the comments, and check out the rest of our Harlem Crime and History series. This is our story, complicated, powerful, and deeply human. See you in the next one.